Okay, I got a clicker, I got a set of slides, I got an audience. What more do I need? Hecklers. I got a couple here because I got a couple of coworkers in the crowd, so ask good questions. Please interrupt. I have no problems with you guys interrupting me with questions in the middle. Hopefully we can all kind of keep it lively, so at least help me stay awake. We've got an agenda. Unfortunately, my customer couldn't travel. That was running into this particular situation and wouldn't let us use their name, which is unfortunate because they're a cool company. So we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about the situation that they got themselves into. This is one of those where it's less of a technical issue than it is kick the can down the road for a couple of years, and now they're at a point where this is going to get painful for a bit. So, and then how did they choose to go down the road of getting to RKE2 from RKE? Okay, I'm one of the solution architects for North America, for the West Coast. This is a West Coast company. So I'll throw a little bit of hints and you guys can try and figure out who they are. We'll leave it at that. Large semiconductor company. They have a Kubernetes platform that they allow their customers, the internal customers, use. So it's one where they've built Kubernetes, multiple sites, multiple clusters, and handed it over to a set of developers to work on. 4 sites, they have a mix of RKE and RKE2. So they're not completely RKE only. 14 clusters total, 11 of them are RKE. So they're based on the announcement, and we'll get to the problem statement here in a moment. But based on that announcement, they got some issues. They got some work to do. They really just turned it over. Hey, Kubernetes is available. Let us know if you want to use it. We'll give you a namespace. Go have fun, is kind of what their approach has been. So we got 3 people that are really kind of the caretakers of the underlying infrastructure, but they really are out there, go do what you want kind of things. They've got one specific customer that owns 5 of the clusters, and that customer is doing the Artifactory pieces. So hardware infrastructure is the team that's using the larger clusters. Oops, sorry about that. Artifactory is running on 5 of the clusters. They are across the 4 sites, all in North America. So all of these sites are in North America here. And it is a good service. Their customers love the service, but they have turned it over and turned it into the wild, wild west. One of the security issues that we've been talking to them about is they allow their developers, when they deploy containers, to mount the developer's home directory via NFS mount into the container. That was my expression as well. Because this started, we did a SUSE security deployment into one of the test clusters up here, because they were going, we'd like to understand what files our developers are accessing in their home directories on the containers. I'm going, really? That's an interesting question. Why are you allowing the developers to map their home directories into their containers? So not what I would call a security first approach to doing Kubernetes. But there's a lot of cool stuff that they've got, that they are doing with these clusters. Okay, here's the initial problem statement. We end-of-lifed RKE. We started talking to these guys way back when we did the announcement. We're going, guys, you gotta think about this. You gotta get some things done. And here's the piece, because as we get closer to the actual end of life, we're now here earlier we were talking to procurement and talking to executive leadership above this team. And they're going, but why are you announcing this? And I'm going, frankly, Rancher, excuse me, Rancher 2 years ago or so was going, we'll support RKE forever. You know, we're going to support it forever. But it's the community that killed Docker. And so that's the reason that we're going, we can only support it for so long on our own. So we've got to really do something about this. And so it was that radical shift of the community that caused us to have to go down that road of really killing the platform. So this was the start of their problems around this, because they've got all those clusters, they're up and running, and if we go take a look, the number next to it was the number of nodes. So they got some decent sized clusters in play. And it's the sort of thing, I can't just stand up a new 59 node cluster right beside this to start moving workloads over. I got to do some planning, I got to do some effort. This is not something I'm, excuse me, that I'm going to take on overnight. And so we've got to kind of work through some of these pieces. The Docker piece, we killed it. They need to re-platform. When you start looking at how do I get from a technical perspective from RKE into an RKE2 platform, I can't just pull nodes out, replace them with RKE2 nodes. They don't intermingle. I've got to build a new cluster and re-platform the applications onto it. There's not a lot of other ways around it, at the end of the day. But why do we love Kubernetes like we do? Why is everybody using Kubernetes? It's that ease of application deployment. GetOps processes, GetOps or DevOps pipelines. I put source code in at the top, I get a container out the bottom. Those pieces make it easy to do deployments. It allows me to not necessarily treat my Kubernetes containers as pets. I get to treat them as cattle. Change the pipeline or change parameters, and it drops that app onto a different container. That's the promise of Kubernetes, right? That's why we all love it. They didn't do that. So platform as a service, 80 plus individual teams are using those clusters. They had the 11 clusters to remediate, of which some of them were very, very large clusters. No real GetOps processes. Like I mentioned earlier, they just handed it over. You want a namespace? Here's a namespace, go have fun. That's it. That's the only governance that they put into their deployments. And so that really, as you see, all of a sudden they have to re-platform. I don't know how to move all these apps. Who's going to do all, excuse me, all of that work? Right here. The customers were responsible for their own deployments. Like I said, here's the namespace. Here's the namespace, go have fun. Complexity. Because of that lack of understanding and lack of process, this turns into a very, very complex environment for them. So questions on what got them here. They've got a whole bunch of clusters. They got to move them. They got a lot of issues around that makes moving to a new RKE2 cluster difficult. Okay, some of the solution options. I kind of like this one, number 3. Since we just started to offer long-term support, write me a check, go have fun, kick the can down the road for a year. And then we'll probably a year from now be in the same space we are right now. But that is a viable option when you've got that complex of an issue. So put the ownership of the redeployment on the customers. That was the other one we suggested. Just build new clusters. Tell them I'm killing this one on a particular date. Get it done. Do all the heavy lifting for them. Because they've got access to the whole cluster. They can start grabbing apps and looking for Helm charts and deployment YAML files and trying to figure things out. So that's one option. The long-term support option, we'll forget about it for a year. Consulting. Their bosses didn't like the consulting option because they're going, why are we writing checks for this? Third-party tools. There is, in doing some research, there's a tool or two out there to help move some apps. This last one, inventory the applications. So this is a fair amount of administrative types of effort to dig in and figure out what our apps are running, who owns those apps, and then work with them to document the deployment process and the creation, documenting or creating deployment processes. Because there's some issues even around this piece. Any questions at this point? So this last statement, at the end of the day, this really isn't a technical issue. Redeploying apps in Kubernetes is relatively easy. Tweak the Helm chart, tweak the deployment YAML file a little bit, deal with some namespace sorts of things, some DNS things. It's not that difficult. But when you've got 80 plus teams that nobody told them that they really had to document this and be able to treat these apps as cattle, it becomes a difficult task. But it's not a technical task. It's an inventory, tracking people down, having meetings, saying you got to go get things done. It's a project management and communication kind of issue. So they have chosen at the moment to do option number 6. We presented them a quote for the long-term support because they're afraid they're not going to be able to hit it by the end of support. So they may end up doing a combination of those, but this was the big piece. They needed to sit down and go, here's all my apps. Here's who owns all of those apps. Here's the communications that I need to do. Here's the pieces that we need to be able to move this app into a new space. The bigger part of this is they needed to build governance around the clusters. What pieces do I need to have to allow a team to use my platform? What are your GitOps pipelines? How are you going to do this? Where are you going to store the artifacts for that application? How, all of those pieces that need to surround those Kubernetes clusters. They hadn't done it multiple years ago. They now need to sit down and put these pieces in place and get their application teams on board. Okay, part of it that they needed to solve is how do I go stand up new clusters? Where do I get the hardware for that? The cool thing was they already had additional hardware on order. They'd already planned on adding capacity to these clusters. And so the plan that we worked together with them on is instead of taking those that new hardware and adding it to existing clusters, especially existing RKE clusters, either stand up a new cluster or add capacity to the RKE2 clusters that you already have and start moving apps over at that point. So what we can do, and actually I'm going to go back to this picture. So for example, site 1, I've got a 59 node cluster that's RKE and a 20 node cluster that's RKE2. They had new hardware slated for that space, for that site. They could add capacity to the 20 node cluster and move apps into that new added capacity. And as they pull apps out of that original cluster, drop those nodes or drop the additional nodes and then move them. So you can, you're not going to do it in an overnight. You're not going to do it in a weekend. This is a significantly multi-stepped kind of process. And so this is what they are doing is added the extra capacity so they had some headroom to go move apps. As they worked with their individual customers, they would go move those teams' apps. And then as they got additional headroom on the original RKE cluster, they just pulled it over. Or dropped nodes, moved them into the RKE2 cluster. But you had to have that new hardware to give you enough headroom to move things around, because they were running pretty tight before they bought that hardware. Same for Site 2, but in Site 2, they actually had to stand up a new cluster because they didn't have an RKE2 cluster at Site 2. Site 4, they were set. Site 3, they had to build a new cluster as well. So they took that new hardware to give them the ability to build those new clusters. If you didn't have that new hardware, because this is all Kubernetes on bare metal. This is where virtualization might come in and things of that nature. Now notice the rancher management clusters, actually they're not really defined here, but the rancher management clusters were RKE as well, because these have been up and running for a number of years. So with the rancher management clusters, the overall goal there was to do a backup and restore. The 3 nodes, back it up, take the rancher services down, redeploy on RKE2, restore the data, and away you go. So that one, they just need a time frame to take those services down and have them offline for a bit. Yes, sir?
Something I didn't see on the solution slide is how did they handle storage? Like the persistent volumes?
For the bulk of these apps, they're ephemeral. They're not using persistent storage, though it does look like they do have some Portworx in place, but it wasn't widespread. And so that's one of those where they would need to move that persistent storage over to the RKE2 cluster as well and have it available both, and then move that data. Did you have a question? Yeah. It looked like you were going,
Yeah, I thought how to move 32 terabytes of storage.
Right. It's not going to be easy for them. But that, I think, is specifically tied to the Artifactory implementations. And the goal with the Artifactory, because that's one group that owns those 5 clusters, is to really sit and take individual clusters completely offline and replace, because they can move some of the services between the Artifactory clusters themselves. And so they can move some of the services that Artifactory provides around. So they had some capability that way. This was the other piece that when we were talking with them early on, is do you know what those pieces are, the GetOps processes? And they didn't have a clue. And then they dug in a little bit and they found most of their developers weren't using GetOps processes to deploy these apps. So this was a big piece to start building these GetOps or DevOps processes to allow you to not have to be in the same situation. The ability to move apps wherever you need to move them. The ability to get some high availability out of the apps. So that was another one of those heartache sort of decisions of, we didn't do it to begin with, we have to do it now kind of design or kind of question. This was the fun one. They actually ran into applications that had been deployed where the people that deployed them had left the company. And it's just like, there was no caretakers for those apps, which was kind of a wild situation for them. Okay, lessons learned. This has been some of those hard-won lessons kind of concepts here. Documenting and refining those deployment processes takes far longer than you estimate. How do, because now I'm working with other teams, they don't necessarily have time to go do these processes. It's important for me, should be important for them because it's their app, but getting the buy-in, getting the people to pay attention long enough to get things done. Because you're working with 80 plus different teams in order to get this work overall done. The abandoned applications, they had a handful of them that they had to take on and go figure out, that they couldn't rely on their internal customer for that info. Should have built the governance to begin with. That promise of Kubernetes being automated deployments should have been some of the key pieces that they required to allow customers onto their cluster. but they didn't. They stood it up and said, y'all go have fun. And so that was one of the big pieces that they learned is we needed to have done this 3 years ago. But instead, they're doing it now and getting it taken care of. That primary effort took them a while to get accomplished. There's lots and lots of work in figuring out who's doing what on their clusters because they didn't have the governance pieces in. And the migration is still in process. I'm not sure it's going to be done by our end of June timeframe. So this has been a fun, not fun, it's been interesting to watch from the outside and to help them with this along the way. But it's been a huge challenge for these guys. So more information. We did provide a cattle drive. So cattle drive is a utility to move just the rancher components of a cluster, to where you can take a snapshot of those rancher components on one and deploy it on a second. And it does some good things, but it doesn't do everything. And so that was the big piece that when we were digging into it with this particular customer, they're going, it gets part of me there. They weren't a big user of projects. They, like I said, most of it, here's your namespace, go have fun. And then the RBOC was just tied to the namespace. And that was it. It wasn't, well, heck, they were mountain home drives. that kind of should paint a picture of their approach to security. So, but Cattle Drive is a tool that is available at that link. Cloud Casa was one tool, third-party tool that I had found and had shown the customer that can do some of that movement piece. We kind of walked through the whole list here. We got the introductions done, customer profile, problem statement, how they are getting to RKE2. A hell of a lot of work and some learning more. And we had some other cool stuff from the audience. I appreciate your time today. Hopefully you guys got a couple more sessions yet. So while we've got a few minutes, what have been your favorite sessions? This one's good? I had fun putting it together. I loved some of the facial expressions when I threw out some of the things that they were doing. That was that was some of my favorite pieces. Like I said, this has been some good lessons learned for me to share with other customers as well. Don't, when they're getting rolling on things, don't do that. Go spend some time over here on the governance and process pieces before you really turn this loose. So thank you guys. I appreciate your attendance today. Hopefully we all learned some things. Appreciate it. Thank you.